How's it going, guys? I'm gonna try something different here, and this is gonna be my first session on Freedom Media. I'm gonna do some online educational programs here, and we're gonna just basically start doing some things here. I'm gonna find some different sources and some information, and again, it's up to you guys to decide whether or not what you believe. And I'm just putting the stuff out here so people can understand what's going on and make sense of everything. So we're going to start out with our usual video of Jamie Nix, and here he is.
This is the song I had to write. It's been keeping me up all night. It's all wrong. What's going on? I'm just doing all I can to make it right. You ask me why I stand up and fight. I do it for love. I do it for freedom. The anthem of life would have no meaning. For my sisters, for my brothers, working man and all the single mothers, for a country whose eyes are getting colder. It's gonna take a lot more of us civilian soldiers. We trust our country to a higher power to keep us strong in our darkest hour. Some wanna win, some try to fail. For all the guilty ones, justice will prevail. They might think we're all half asleep, following their trail of deceit. That's why we fight to keep our freedom, freedom, freedom. We do it for love, we do it for freedom. The anthem of life would have no meaning. It's for our sisters, for our brothers, the working man and all the single mothers, for a country whose eyes are getting colder. It's gonna take a lot more of us civilian soldiers. Civilian Oh, let's do it for love. Let's do it for freedom. The anthem of life would have no meaning. It's for our sisters, for our brothers, the working men and all the single mothers. United we roll, rolling for freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Talking about love for our brothers, the working man and all the single mothers. We do it for love, we do it for freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom.
And as you guys know, United We Roll is right. United We Roll is rolling again, guys. We know that Greta Thunberg is coming to Edmonton on Friday. So we have OP22 is heading on up. They're getting a convoy going to get in on it. So if anybody wants to get involved, you're more than welcome to get in on that convoy. And contact Glenn or Haley. They'll let you in on what's going on. And hopefully it doesn't turn into a bunch of the left saying that everybody's bullying this girl. I think this girl needs to come and get herself educated. She may think she's educating the public, but I think that she needs to learn that Canada's pretty good at keeping the environment clean, and we've strived to keep everything the way things need to be. We're pretty good at keeping it all good. Anyways, I have a few videos I put together here for you guys. You can listen to this and see what you think.
With the Paris Climate Agreement put to bed, climate mania seems to have died down for the time being. So I think it's time for a little dose of reality, because it's getting colder and drier, and it's all because of the sun and the planets. You see, everything that happens on Earth happens in cycles. The only straight line is in man's mind. There are no straight lines in nature. Everything in nature is formed by spinning spheres or waves. So when you tell me that the temperature is going to go straight up, I become more than a little skeptical, because nothing ever goes straight up, and certainly not forever. Let's look at climate cycles over the past 11,000 years. The big picture. You can see on this diagram that we came out of the glacial period about 10,000 years ago. And then we had these up and down periods of warm and cold, cycles. It's like a giant sine wave. Temperature moves up and down over time on a highly predictable schedule. Today, we're in what's called the modern warm period, and there's climate mania, even though it's been warmer on Earth many times before. In fact, the trend line shows it's gradually getting cooler because the sun is cooling. Nobody disputes that. Well, no astrophysicists at any rate. The next cold period is signified by the dark blue blob right below climate mania. It's starting now. But how do we know all this? Well, in the early 1900s, Dr. Raymond Wheeler, with a team of about 200 researchers, analyzed climate back about 20 centuries to 600 BC. He used tree rings and sunspot records to plot both temperature and rainfall over that entire period. He identified major climate cycles of 100, 170, 515, and 1,030 years. Now, he predicted extreme weather at about the year 2000, followed by a turn colder and a long-term drought. And sure enough, that's exactly what seems to be happening. In fact, the global temperature has gone sideways since 1998. Oh, yes, it has. And the recent drop in solar activity is warning of a much colder time coming ahead. What's more, the head of the International Space Station, a Russian astrophysicist with a name I can't pronounce, has publicly predicted a mini ice age is on the way. Now, let's drill down to the most recent 4,000 years. This chart uses data from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. It comes from the Greenland Ice Core Research Project ending in 1992. Ice cores are an extremely accurate method of determining temperature back through the centuries. What's interesting about this chart is that it accurately supports all of Dr. Wheeler's cycles. You can see the large temperature peaks every 1,030 years, the red arrows. These extremely warm and wet periods supported bountiful crops so that major societies grew to the height of their power. Dr. Wheeler called it the civilization cycle. You can see the 172-year peaks as well, the orange arrows. In almost every case, the temperature turned colder at the 172-year mark. Now, 2007 was the most recent major turn date. But the other remarkable thing about this chart is the correlation with major civilizations. When the climate turns warm and wet for long periods, the world's greatest empires have emerged. Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Mayans, the Vikings, and so on. When the climate grew colder, these great cultures fell into ruin. Bad things start to happen when climate turns cold. Rome burned as it got colder. Hadrian's Wall was built to keep out invaders at the bottom of a cold spell. Social mood always turns negative with colder climate, and that brings about riots and wars. Cold periods often get labeled as dark ages because there is little advancement in living standards. So here we are at the top of the modern warm period. Unless this time is different, the Earth is going to get a lot colder and drier, most likely for several hundred years. We'll also see a major financial collapse. Yeah, that's one of the great features of the 172-year cycle. It's happened throughout history like clockwork. So, we've spent billions of dollars on this climate mania for nothing, really. We had this information more than a century ago. The sun and the planets are the main drivers of climate change on our tiny little planet. We know that. We can't change Mother Nature. It's going to get colder and drier. There's no question about that. You see, history repeats over and over and over again. So if you want to know the future, you look at the past. But of course, nobody does that. They'd much rather program computers to try to simulate what they think is man-made warming. Meanwhile, just when we're going to need more energy and warmth, we have politicians trying to tax it out of existence and shut down coal plants. If we paid attention to cycles and history, maybe we could plan for the tough times every 172 years.
Respectfully, I have a few questions for climate strike activists. 1. Why aren't the top polluting countries targeted in the climate strike? A simple search and you could really figure out which rivers are polluting the most and which countries are polluting the most. But they're never targeted. Why are the top environmental activist cities in the United States, such as San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York, the dirtiest and most polluted cities in the United States? Also in California, the highest poverty rate, but celebrities have no problem getting on television and telling the rest of the country how to keep clean and help the lower and working class. Third question is, why is weather manipulation technology never talked about? It's mainstream news now. In Business Insider, they're talking about how China has the ability to manipulate weather. Popular Science and others pointed out the fact that Bill Gates went for a patent to manipulate hurricanes, and that type of technology goes all the way back decades ago and is even on government websites talking about attempts to manipulate the weather. So in all of these talks about man-made climate change and how we can affect the climate, why are they never talking about proven ways that we can actually affect the climate? Isn't that a little bit odd that they always just want to tax you, take your money, and tell you what you can and can't do? And my fourth question is, why does nobody ever point out that most of planet Earth is unexplored? Sounds like a crazy stat, but it's true. According to government websites and all over the place, most of the ocean is unexplored. If you do the math, most of planet Earth is ocean, so if most of the ocean is unexplored, that means that most of Earth is unexplored. So the science can't be settled about a planet that you haven't discovered most of. Yet egotistical people like Neil Tyson go on podcasts and say, well, we think we know everything about the universe.
And so it's the collection of all the data that gives us the complete understanding, what we think is a complete understanding of the universe. So
how can you know everything about the universe or think that you know everything about the universe when you don't even know most of your own home planet? So I grew up an environmentalist. I rushed to the theaters to see Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth as a kid, and I was disappointed that my parents and everybody else didn't care about this stuff. Now as an adult, much older, much wiser, and much more knowledgeable, I actually looked at the data. So let's look at it. This came from NASA under a year ago. There's a lot of snowfall you see on the map. Some places are freezing, some places are melting, but the sea level rise wasn't rising like they said it was, or to be honest, like they've said for decades and decades in Time magazine, in AP. They've been saying this stuff for literally 40, 50 years now. But in that article, they even admit not only is it not rising like they thought, but they only measure the coastlines of Antarctica, and their best satellites can't even measure the snowfall. So the science isn't settled. They admit in their own article that their best science doesn't really track or measure everything. So here's what they call Greenland's fastest melting glacier, which is the Jakobshavn Glacier, which is actually growing for the third year straight. This is directly out of a NASA government website. Remember when I showed you that map of Antarctica and how it's melting in some places and growing in some places? Well, recently they actually found an active volcano under the Antarctic ice sheet and had the gall to say, maybe that's why it's melting. Maybe not though. Maybe it's climate change. Maybe it's not. Of course an active volcano is going to have an effect on ice, but they don't seem to want you to think that in the news, so they constantly just throw out pictures of polar bears and scream at you if you question the legitimate science that I'm saying now. They say, no, go in the streets, march, give us your tax money, scream, cry, act like the world's gonna end. An active volcano. That's what they found, but they like to whisper that. There's a great video, I'm not going to play it for time reasons, of the Weather Channel founder on CNN explaining how the percentage of scientists that they say the science is settled is a total political lie, how it's being funded, how he gets silenced as the founder of the Weather Channel, saying that the whole thing has absolutely been blown out of proportion and he's not a denier, he's a skeptic. And last but not least, here's Ethiopia planting 350 million trees in 12 hours. So if there's truly a carbon crisis in the air, that's literally what trees do, and they spit out oxygen. And I'm questioning if activists who march in the streets, did you actually plant any trees, or did you just make signs out of cardboard, wood, and paper, and then, like many rallies that I've been to, throw them in the middle of the street when there's no trash can to put them in, and ignore the fact that the worst homelessness in the country is just a couple blocks away? These are my questions for you. So I'm in no way, shape, or form a science denier. In fact, that term is a propaganda term made up to cover up inconvenient science that they don't want to talk about. Science like how much of the earth is explored, science like volcanoes, science like the sun, which is very bright, heats up our planet, and we pretty much have no control over, as far as we know. Science like how ice cycles possibly work. When the older generation was growing up, they told everybody there was going to be an ice age, and then they switched it to global warming, and then they said it's just climate change because they're not quite sure. Some places will get warmer, some places will get colder. And the truth is, okay, we haven't explored the planet. We understand pollution is bad. That's why the environmental cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, before they lecture the whole country, either talk to Africa or China as well, or clean up your own cities and your own streets. Nobody wants to hear the most polluted, most dirty place in the country tell everybody else how to be clean and protect the environment. So let's have a real conversation. Let's talk about cleaning the oceans. Let's talk about cleaning the water. Let's talk about cleaning the air. Let's talk about not destroying our planet. But in doing so, screaming, organizing, calling everybody who uses real science a science denier because they don't just march in the street like zombies whenever Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye tells them to, that's not a solution, and that's not science. And the science isn't settled on planet Earth. Science doesn't really settle. New creatures are being found every single day, new discoveries, new science, new artificial intelligence. So the left wing needs to realize, just because you realize that oil companies are corrupt and they do lie, doesn't mean you're not getting lied to as well. Because if you really look at the data and you really use your brain, you actually are. You're being lied to, you're being used, and they're taking good energy and good ideas and getting you to do pretty much nothing to solve the problem. That's my thoughts. Let me know yours. God bless you. Thank you for watching, and have a good day. Please like this page, subscribe, or don't. It doesn't really matter. Have a good one.
The climate activists actually are really worried about cleaning up the planet and the environment and everything. Why are they not going to the actual places that pollute? I think, Greta coming to Alberta, that's a slap to Alberta, that's a slap to Canada. I think because the narrative right now is that we're at a climate crisis in Canada and in the oil sands and everything else. I think that's just a chance for them to come here and try and put some leverage on us, especially before the election. If you really wanted to make a difference on the planet, maybe you should start out at China. But we all know what happens if the climate activists are going to head over to China. That is not going to go over well. So I got a little bit of a chart here I wanted to show everybody. And basically what we're looking at here is a comparison with the greenhouse gas. And it's the CO2 in megatons. So here's what China puts out in a year is 12,454 megatons compared to the USA's 6,673 megatons and Canada's measly little 738, which equates to basically 1.63% of the world's greenhouse gas. China's reaching 27.5 on their own. Now, if you look at the actual the physical size, they are fairly close in comparison. Of course, Canada is the largest at 9.98, but we're all relatively close in size. Now you look at the actual the population, where we have 37 million people. The United States has 327 million. Look at China, 1.386 billion. So you know why that they're so high. But I think there's a lot of other people out here that need to actually probably go and get China cleaned up first, because we could shut everything down in our whole country and never drive a vehicle, no industries, no pollution for a year, and China would make up for what that did in probably less than a month. for what we actually saved. So we're not really gaining anything on any of this. It's really, we got to start looking at where the problems are in the world, and it sure is not Canada.
Drought, flooding, and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time, and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us is that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics, and second, even if the claims, the more radical claims, are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. It was like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize. But they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents. And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's just, It's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, being concerned about global warming. It's like, one of the reasons there's more trees in the northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing.
Drought.
So yeah, we can't really fix the environment without having a solution first. We can't shut down coal plants without having something as an alternative. And solar and wind, we know, don't work. I work with solar in my field now, and I know it doesn't work. It's not cheap enough. It's not economical enough. The storage is the problem. People have heard that in Saskatchewan we had SAS Power doing the net metering program. They've already shut that down because they exceeded what they wanted for people being on the net metering program 2 years ahead of schedule. So here's where you're at now. There's no solutions, and the solutions aren't coming quick enough. So how do you just shut everything off? It's not easy to do. Now, if we go and look over here, I'm going to show you. This is a thing I found about Switzerland. And it talks about that Switzerland emphasized the climate change's impacts on human health, and children were among those most vulnerable to these impacts, which included heat stress, respiratory problems, and increased risk of food poisoning. Climate change had implications for international security, including the spread of epidemic diseases, food security, economic stability, and migration. Switzerland emphasized that the Paris Agreement explicitly called for the protection of the rights of the child, and Switzerland aimed to take into account both emissions reduction and protection of human health and its foreign assistance. This can be done, for example, by supporting measures to reduce the effects of climate change and its causes, such as greenhouse emissions, by promoting clean cook stoves instead of burning wood. Well, there you go. That's just what Jordan Peterson was talking about. So the Swiss Constitution established that the Swiss people and cantons have responsibilities towards future generations, and that children have the right to special protection of their integrity and development. Now you're kind of starting to see what's going on with Greta here, and why that they put her as a front runner in of what's going on with the UN and everything else. They're basically using her as a pawn, which is really kind of sad to use children, because they don't know exactly what's going on, because they don't have enough knowledge to know what's really going on around the world. So Switzerland further noted that it's advocated for strengthening of gender considerations, and is a process of adopting the third optional protocol of the CRC. Switzerland's climate change adaptation strategy called for mitigation and adaptation policies that are sensitive to vulnerable populations, such as children, and take into account the interest of future generations in the context of their international cooperation. Switzerland launched a series of youth climate dialogues and other partnerships that connected stakeholders in the field of climate change policy, and supported a youth space at COP22. They also participated in a youth conference on the environment in November 2016, where participants were able to submit their recommendations and perspectives on how to integrate the needs of vulnerable populations into climate change policy. Switzerland emphasized that improved education was key, and also highlighted its domestic efforts in this regard. So now you kind of see why they're online with trying to get everything going, and you see that now they put the spokesperson has been made Greta Thunberg, and as far as we know, we've done a little bit of research, and it's looking kind of like along with her parents, that they have George Soros and Al Gore behind them. And that's why they're pushing around the planet. Another one I want to show you, and this guy is really smart when it comes to a lot of exposing stuff. And this is Bjorn Lomberg, and he's pretty smart. Watch this guy.
Ryan Doyle in for Michael Corin this evening. You know, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, a drought, it always seems that it comes back to extreme weather being blamed on one thing: climate change. Even in my own household, I know that the second we see a story that it has to do with flooding, well, that always gets blamed on climate change, and then the debate rages, even in my own kitchen. Bjorn Lomborg is a professor, director of the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He's got a new book out that we're going to talk about thoroughly in the next few minutes. But Bjorn, let's talk a little bit about the idea of extreme weather being blamed and pinned on climate change. That's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, listen, it's really one of those memes that everybody talks about, but really has very little backing in the scientific literature. Now, there are some things that are going to get worse with global warming, and some things are going to get better. But we need to recognize there's not just a one-to-one correlation with more global warming, more extreme weather. Take, for instance, heat and cold waves. Sure, as temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves, and hence, we're going to see more people dying from heat. That's absolutely true. But you can't say that unless you also say, but there's going to be fewer cold waves, and hence fewer people dying from cold. And since almost everywhere on the planet, many, many more people die from cold than from heat, that actually turns out to be a net benefit. We actually expect that by mid-century, about 1.4 million fewer people will die from heat and cold waves because of global warming. That's one of the stories you don't normally hear.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because when you write it down and I read it on paper, it seems to make common sense to me. But explaining that yin and yang approach, I'm guessing, can be quite a challenge.
Oh, it totally can. And listen, for instance, when people talk about flooding, yes, we are going to see more heavy precipitation. That's absolutely true. But there are two things you need to remember. First, more precipitation, which we're expecting to see from global warming, also means that we will have fewer people with water scarcity. We are expecting about 3 billion people being water scarce by the end of the century, mostly because there are many, many more people by the end of the century. But because of global warming, there'll actually be 1.2 billion fewer people water scarce. You need to tell both sides of the story. But of course, in Canada and elsewhere, you still worry about flooding. But remember, flooding is mostly a consequence of people damming in rivers. Essentially what we've done is we've built on all the floodplains, we've put up dams, and we're essentially playing a game of who doesn't have the lowest dike, which of course is a very, very poor way of trying to handle future problems with flooding. We need to let some places have the ability to flood on floodplains like they did in times of old.
When we talk about somebody at the local coffee shop blaming things on climate change, that's one thing. When the President of the United States comes out and seemingly wants to blame every extreme weather pattern or extreme weather event on climate change, that's dangerous, no?
Well, it leads to bad policy, fundamentally saying there are these terrible catastrophes that are happening and they're all caused by global warming. Essentially makes you say we're going to try to handle these problems through cutting carbon emissions. Take, for instance, Hurricane Sandy, which a lot of people blame on global warming. Fundamentally, what the science is telling us is we don't quite know, but we're probably likely to see slightly stronger but slightly fewer hurricanes. Overall, we're actually expecting that hurricanes are going to damage less by the end of the century, mostly because we'll be more resilient. But the real issue here is to remember most of the hurricanes are going to happen no matter what. If you actually want to help future victims of Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina and all the others, you need to focus on making communities resilient. You actually end up focusing on the wrong policies, and then of course you end up subsidizing, for instance, wind and solar at huge amounts, cutting virtually no CO2 and achieving nothing on climate, but also achieving nothing on making people more resilient. That's sort of the worst of all outcomes. That's why we need to have this honest debate on global warming.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the debate that will probably be ramped up in the next couple of months. The UN releasing their summary. They've obviously studied this. This is the fifth report coming out in the last 20 some odd years. But I fear that a lot of people will hear the headlines and go into a full panic like we did some years ago when the last report came out.
And that's actually a funny thing, Ryan, because if you read the report, there's been lots of leaks, and we have a pretty good sense of what it's going to be telling us. It's not a scary report. It tells us global warming is a problem. It actually ramps down some of the really scary scenarios, and it mostly tells us this is something we need to focus on, this is an issue we need to tackle. But it does not tell us those scary stories. It tells us sea levels are going to rise somewhere between 40 and 62 centimeters. I bet most of the numbers most people hear is a meter, 2 meters, or Al Gore's 7 meters to sea level rise. That's just not in the cards. This is a problem, but it's by no means the end of of humanity. And so we need to start having a conversation about how do we tackle it smartly, and also how do we not go so panicked that we end up spending all the money on policies that almost don't work.
What about the blame game? I know that they are going to come out. I mean, as you said, a lot of this has been leaked, and blame about 95% of this on being man-made. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think what they're actually saying is that they're 95% certain that more than half of the warming we've seen since 1950 is caused by mankind. That's probably actually true, but what you fail to hear is that that's not very much. Remember, we haven't seen all that much. We've seen a little more than 1 degree over the last half century, and so at least half of that is due to mankind, which is probably pretty true. Most people seem to say, that's all of it. But remember, over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen very little or no warming, which is probably because we're in the cold phase of both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And so what we're essentially seeing is in the 80s and 90s, we over-worried, and now we're probably almost under-worrying about global warming. But the fundamental truth is global warming is a problem. It's going to cost a couple of degrees, maybe even 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. But it's not this catastrophe that you're led to believe.
I'm glad you mentioned the past years, because people, I think, fail to look at the past and look at history. I know your new book does a lot of that. Let's come back and talk a little bit about it. We'll also talk about renewable energy versus fossil fuels and that kind of thing. Bjorn Lomborg is my guest. We continue this conversation. I think it's fascinating when you look at what you've done in your book. You've talked to economists about the last 150 years of things that really have plagued or blighted the world. Why economists? Why talk to them?
Well, fundamentally, this is about getting a sense both of how big are the problems, but also how big are they compared to each other. We have this sense in which we often just talk about what looks the scariest on TV, but in reality, we need to get a sense of what actually matters. And often, that's the kind of catastrophes that happen away from the television screen, things that are not sexy, things that don't have these great campaign groups, but just happen to be incredibly, incredibly important. So what I did was I asked some of the world's top economists to look at their field on each individual area, from health and from air pollution and global warming and biodiversity and gender and all the other places, and say, how much have these problems cost the world in 1900, in 1901, 1902, all the way up to now until 2050? So we basically get a sense of, is the world moving in the right direction or the wrong direction?
What would you say the most fascinating thing to come out of this research and these conversations was in that last 150-year period?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples because I really don't want to. I'm not very good at picking. I think they're all incredibly interesting. We looked at 10, but one perhaps kind of obvious when you think about it is health. We lived in 1900. The average lifespan of a human being was 32 years. 32 years. Today, that number is 69 years. In 2050, we expect to live 76 years on average on this planet. That's a huge benefit. And if you just look at one of the things I think we've totally forgotten how incredible it is. In 1970, we almost didn't inoculate kids. We didn't actually immunize them very much. Today, we've immunized so many kids that every year about 3 million kids survive more than would otherwise have survived. That's more than died through the 20th century wars. That's just simply one of the uncelebrated stories. And this is the Gates Foundation and many others who've helped make this happen. But this is the reality. We've seen a dramatic improvement in our health, and we need to remember that. The other one you asked for, I think, is that perhaps more surprising. When you look at pollution, most people think about global warming because it has so much airtime. But the real environmental problem in this world is actually air pollution. Air pollution kills about 5 million people each year. And then again, you think, oh, it's outdoor air pollution that sees Bangkok and all these polluted third world cities. But in reality, most of the air pollution is indoor air pollution. It's poor people, about 3.2 billion people who cook and keep warm with bad fuels, twigs and cow dung and all the other stuff. And that has come down dramatically. Over the 20th century, about 260 million people died from indoor air pollution. That's twice the number of people that died in all the wars of the 20th century. So again, it's about getting a grip and actually realizing this world is a much better place now than it was in 1900. And we're actually moving in the right direction also for 2050.
Let's talk a little bit about how we do heat our homes and other such power sources. Renewable energies, a lot of people have said, you know, these are the best for us. These are the things that we need to be relying on. But you've made the argument over time that fossil fuels, they have an upside too.
Well, what most people think is renewables is this fantastic new thing that we really need to get on right now. But remember, humanity has spent the last couple of centuries getting away from renewables. These renewables are the ones that are actually killing people, especially in third world countries. If you look at the rate that we used renewables, in 1800, we estimate the world got about 94% of all its energy from renewables. And since 1960, that number has been down to about 13%, and it hasn't budged. Despite all the good green efforts, we haven't changed the percentage of what the world gets from renewable energy. And by far, the major part of this is simply poor people burning wood in their homes and, of course, contributing to deforestation. What we need to remember is renewables are not going to be a solution to global warming anytime soon for two reasons. Partly because it's incredibly expensive still, but also because it's intermittent. You don't know what to do when you don't have the sun shining or when the wind is not blowing. We don't have the technology to back this up yet at any reasonable cost. And that's why we're still not, even with very, very optimistic scenarios, going to see more than perhaps 17% of the world's energy come from renewables in 2035. So we really need to get real about this. We're not going to solve global warming with renewables anytime soon.
Yet politician after politician seemingly wants to go that route and drag taxpayers along with them.
Absolutely, and we're spending huge amounts of money. In Europe, for instance, we've decided we want to cut carbon emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. That would probably cost about 0.7% of GDP had we just done it in the smartest way, which would be to shift from coal to gas. Now, that's still a huge truckload of money. It's about $125 billion per year to achieve that. But we also decided, no, we don't want to do it the cheapest possible way. We want to do it with renewables. We want to put up solar panels and wind turbines to feel good about ourselves. Of course, nature doesn't care, so we're actually spending twice as much.
I don't want to give all away that's in the book because it's fantastic stuff, but we appreciate you taking the time to share a sample of it today.
Great to meet you. See you.
Ryan Doyle in from...
So once again, guys, here you go. Here we go. We start seeing different... people talk about different facets of what's going on here, and in the end, there's only so many things we can do, right? We all have to do our part to clean up the environment. There's no doubt about it. In Canada, what we need to do is we need to get people working mainly. So in order to be able to get people working and look after our environment, we need to get pipelines in the ground. We need to get oil from moving on trains and semis and everything else that's more dangerous, and we need to start some national tree planting programs, and we need to invest in technology. Technology is the only thing that we can do now. You know, like the boys said there, you know, we've came a long way since the dirty 30s and all the times we've been burning wood, and we're slowly moving up and cleaning things up as we go. So if we invest this technology in, like, my backyard here where we have our carbon capture units at the coal-fired power plants, this is our best avenue to try and clean this stuff up. So this is just a little bit of thing I wanted to do tonight. I'm going to try and keep these around a half an hour or so it's not a long drawn-out thing, and I probably will be doing watch parties so I can watch along with you and comment along with you. And as time goes by, I'm going to start doing some more things here, maybe bring some people in live. And this is kind of what I'm going to start working at now, just to do some information sessions and stuff like that. So make sure you guys share this out there. I'll be watching along with you once I post it. And yeah, let's keep educating Canadians Anybody that wants to get involved in the convoy going to Edmonton Friday, you can get a hold of Haley or Glenn. I'm not going to make it myself. I'm going to be stuck here working, and I hope things go good for them. I hope they're not going to be attacked by the left like they usually do. Maybe worse this time because, they're going to start saying they're trying to bully. And that's just the way things go, guys. We're always going to get hit. Like they said before, when you get the puck, you're going to get hit. So anyways, guys, thanks for coming and checking out the very first broadcast. Freedom Media. I'm going to keep doing some things here as time goes by. Through the winter time, I'll have more time. I'm going to start compiling some of our videos even from the convoy and get some stuff out there. So thanks for coming out. Share this out, guys, and I'll be talking to you soon. Have a good night, guys. And get out there and vote. Get off the couch.